Welcome to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger. The Claw is the marketing podcast for C-suite executives, and I am joined today by a really great guest. It's someone who believes in the power of the podcast. It is Tom Schwab with Interview Valet. He and I have been doing this podcasting thing for a hot minute. So, Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Eric, I am thrilled to be here.
So tell me a little bit about Interview Valet for those that don't know what your company does.
Sure. So my viewpoint is that obscurity is our biggest problem, right? There's thousands, tens of thousands of people we could help if they only knew about us. So what Interview Valet does is we help thought leaders, brands, coaches, consultants get out on targeted podcast interviews so that you can talk directly to your ideal customers. Right, this idea of breaking through the noise, I think has gotten to be laughable, right? Everybody's yelling, nobody's getting heard. So we allow people to tap into other people's audiences so they can talk directly to their ideal customers, turn them into leads, customers, and really build their brand and build their business.
And as I was doing kind of my background notes, you send over a nice sheet to, get people prepared. And one of the things you talked about, if you think about it in the investment category, right? Always build a business based on other people's money. One of your quotes is working on other people's networks, or what is it? Other people's, I missed it. An OPP, isn't it?
I said OPP, and then somebody pointed out that has different meanings. So I say OPA, other people's audiences.
That's right.
Right. Okay. Because other people's money, right? Well, money's not as cheap as it used to be.
Right.
But, the idea of if Oprah's going to give you $1 million, or say, hey, do you want to come on my show to talk to my audience? Most people would say, well, give me the appearance.
Right.
Share of attention, if you can get that, is amazing. And I think, you look at the data on podcasts, 70% of the people listen to the entire episode, right?
Wow.
I don't know of a whole lot of other mediums where they're spending that much attention.
Yeah, they typically break in and out or skim an article or something like that. What's interesting for me, just to kind of give you a little background in how I ended up in podcasting, I had hired a marketing agency, and I was the guy that was kind of hidden in the back and nobody knew me. And they had told me that I needed to start standing on stages and giving speeches. I was like, that sounds really scary. And so I said, you know what? I can start a podcast. And it was an audio-only podcast. I pre-recorded it. And I was like, if I don't like it, I never have to release it. And so it was kind of an easy way for me to get into that, starting to build an audience. And what I learned about it is I would then spend 45 minutes to an hour getting to know somebody, and we would become almost fast friends. Like I knew them as a connection, and I can point to a good portion of business that I've generated from having someone on my podcast. And ultimately I did a radio show for a couple of years too. So it's a really powerful platform. I know I'm kind of stealing the types of things you talk about, but I really can't speak enough about it. So tell me, how did you get into this space?
Well, everything is sort of evolutionary, not revolutionary.
Okay. Yeah.
So my last company was HubSpot's first e-commerce case study.
Okay.
So we built it up from a regional player to a national leader. And we did that with guest blogging, right?
Yeah.
Tapping into somebody else's audience. So after I sold that, I was in a sabbatical period and was in a mastermind with a bunch of other CEOs. And they were asking, well, how did you do this? And by that time, blogs were past their prime, right? And so 2014, I started to think, wonder if you could use podcast interviews almost like we used to use guest blogs, right? Or almost like we used to use talking at the Chamber of Commerce or the Rotary Club or whatever it was, to be on television. How could you use that to tap in? And so we started to test it. It worked great. I wrote this cheesy little PDF at the very beginning, gave it away to everybody that asked for it. Then people said, well, can you teach me how to do this? So I tried teaching them, and I never took the course out of beta because the people that were honest just said, I don't want to learn how to do this. I want to be the guest. You just take care of all the rest.
Right.
So with a lot of encouragement from them, we beta tested it. It worked great. And then we launched it in 2016. And, now it's grown to, a team of 30. I always say my microphone makes me sound good. My team makes me look good.
Nice. So I did a radio show for 2 years, and one of our struggles, it was an hour-long live radio show on AM, every Monday through Friday. And so we worked I remember the first month with my team, just scheduling enough guests, because I don't actually think I'm very interesting on my own. Like, don't put me in front of a microphone for half an hour to an hour. I just can't talk to myself, right? And this AM station was used to a bunch of, angry men about whatever, and they would talk to themselves for an hour. And I'm like, you want me to talk about business? I need to talk to another business owner about it. And so we worked, and I think very rarely did I ever have to run the show myself. But think about the number of people we had to get into that studio to do those interviews. So the service you guys provide is a very important one to the person who's trying to do the podcast.
And I've done radio interviews, and I find those intimidating, because you've got to go to the studio, and it's a different environment. You've got to follow a clock, right? Because we got to get commercials in. Whereas a podcast, you're sitting in your home, in your office. There's no hard, fast clock, right? If I run late on a story, we're not going to news and weather on the 5s.
Right.
So it's so much easier. And I agree with you, to talk by yourself, right? If you say, can you give a 45-minute keynote to this group? No, I need some preparation on that. But it's like, hey, do you want to have a discussion? You want to talk for 45 minutes?
Yeah.
That's easy. That's fun.
Yeah. And what I learned with it too, because I had been doing podcasting prior, and then they were like, hey, you want to do a radio show? And I was like, sure, sounds great. And so I did that, and I was giving away, because it would take me an hour to get to the studio. I had an hour radio show, and then I was an hour after. So if you think about it, that was 15 hours of billable time. And at that point, I was mostly doing kind of COO contract work. So I was like, I'm giving away 15 hours. And then what we found is that most of our listeners, and this was pre-pandemic, were on demand. They would listen to the show on demand. We would really sit across social media platforms and Lipsum and all those kind of places. And that was where we would cut it up into chunks, and put it on social media. And so I was like, why am I driving down to a studio every day? So we went back to doing batch processing. So we do, 5 or 6 in a day. Then we kind of control the release schedule. And it's also, for me, one of the ways that we get customers to do it, because they're not giving away so much time. I mean, I think people think about a podcast and are like, oh my gosh, that's so much effort. And it really doesn't have to be that much of your time that you're giving away.
Really. And you think about what you just said with the radio, right? You had studio time that you had to be there. So if you invited somebody to be a guest, it's like, okay, there's these limited spots. Yeah. Or, if you're on television, if you get invited to be on the Today Show, right? They're going to say, here's the date, be at New York City at 4 a.m. on this day, right? Whereas with a podcast, when they invite you on, they usually send you the calendar link and said, pick a time that works for you. So you can work it around your schedule. And like you said, I've jumped on an airplane to fly across country to talk to 100 ideal customers.
Yeah.
And to think about that now, you can jump on a podcast from your home, from your office, and talk to tens of thousands of them, and across time too.
Yeah. So talk to me. So I'm the frozen chosen. So I'm a believer, right? Like, I've been doing this for a while. So when you run into someone new, and I think I talked to you right before the show about the fact we sell primarily to B2B customers. So, business to business, relational sales, we have to educate. It's not a transactional sale. So it's really important for them to get their message out there and understand. But we run into hesitancy. Like, they're like, and so what are some of the objections that you run into when you talk to somebody about starting a podcast, and how do you get around them when you're selling them on it?
I see a couple of major ones, right? The first one is they've got this misconception that, everything's got to be a funnel, and it's got to be metrics, and, all I need to do is send out 10,000 emails and the cash register is going to ring. And I think we're taking things that used to work in the past and saying they'll still work today, or things that work for a $5 transaction and going, these will work for a B2B, where it's, the engagements are longer. It's, 6-figure engagement.
Yeah. And
the idea, you ask clients, do you really think that somebody is going to hire your company, right? Because they saw you on a TikTok video, right?
Yeah.
Is that going to work? I remember one client came to us, and I was asking him, well, why do you want to do podcast interviews? And I loved his answer. He said that he viewed most of social media as the digital equivalent of advertising above urinals. And I paused and I'm like, what do you mean by that? And he's like, listen, I'm selling to businesses, to very professional people, professional buyers, right? If they see me on a bus or a park bench or above the urinal or on a TikTok doing a dance, he's like, that's a reason for them not to hire me, right? Yeah. I want them to see me in places that help. I want them to know that they get to know, like, and trust me, right? So, and this idea of marketing is supposed to be like a magnet, right? And everybody says, oh, yeah. But they forget a magnet's supposed to attract the right people and repel the wrong people.
Right.
And so some people are like, well, what if everybody doesn't like me on the podcast? Great, right?
Perfect. Yeah.
You just want the people that are going to be ideal customers, profitable customers to come, right? At the end of the day, we don't need all need more leads. We need more great customers, great profits.
Yeah.
And one of our clients, past client, Gail Moody Bird, she is now the CMO of Sales Navigator. And I love one of the things that she says is that we are all getting more efficient at things that are becoming less effective, right? In the time that we've been talking here, both of us could have sent 1 million emails, right? What were we thinking, right? Why were we wasting our time on this? Well, that 1 million emails would not have any effect, right? Nobody's looking at them. They're going to spam filters, all the rest of that. Yeah. So often we have to look at what are we optimizing for?
Yeah.
The other thing that I hear people say is, especially when it's the talent, as we call it, right? The CEO, the spokesperson, they're like, well, what would I have to talk about?
Yeah.
Right. And somebody helped me with this. It was a friend of mine that's a lawyer. And he said the legal definition of an expert is someone that knows more by their training, their education, their experience than the average person, right? So you're on a podcast, you're an expert, right? It's not the undisputed, world-renowned expert, but they're going to ask you only things about your business, your industry, your opinion, all of those things that we have expertise in, love sharing about it, right? Nobody's going to get on a podcast and then all of a sudden ask you on, what's your thoughts on the latest action of the Fed, right? Unless that's what your expertise is.
Yeah.
And so, and I think there's some hesitancy there.
Yeah.
Right. The best CEOs, right, are humble, right? But they love talking about their kids and their business, right? And I'm redundant on that because it's sort of the same.
Yeah.
Right. So they want to talk about that. And it's not really an interview, right? We use the word podcast interview, but to me, an interview is like 60 minutes, right? Where they've got 10 questions and number 4 is a gotcha.
Yeah. They're trying to trick you. Yeah. That's the thing. You don't have to be so prepared, right? It's conversation. And people who would have come in prepared, they would throw their notes away 2 or 3 minutes into the interview because I'm like, you're never going to read them. And if you do, you're going to sound terrible. So like, let's just talk. Yeah.
This is a discussion, right? This is the same discussion we would be having over a cup of coffee or a beer. It's just that, hey, we're just recording it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it becomes such a nice, what we call a high value piece, because we can then turn it into like bite-sized chunks and spread it out on social media. So I love it anytime anyone will do video because we can then create so many other pieces of content from it. It's like the masterpiece of content versus trying to go the other way, right? So, well, we're going to take a commercial break. And when we get back, I want to talk a little bit about, let's share some lessons learned about, our podcasting journey. So some things that we've seen work, maybe make mistakes, because you see lots of them, I'm sure, and how people may set things up and really how they can maximize this as a platform, specifically for, sales and marketing and making connections. So we'll be back in just a second. I'm talking to Tom Schwab. He is with Interview Valet, and we're talking about podcasting on a podcast. You're listening to The Claw, which is the marketing podcast for C-suite executives, and we'll be back in just a second.
The Claw podcast is brought to you by Liger Partners. Liger Partners is a premier marketing firm where we save the world from boring, broken marketing. We get underdogs recognition because you deserve it. For more information, go to ligerpartners.com and follow us on all social media platforms at Liger Partners.
And we're back. You're listening to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger. I'm joined today by Tom Schwab. He is the CEO of Interview Valet, and he is an expert at podcasting. He knows and has talked to more people. I've done a lot of podcasts. He's done and talked to tons of people in the category of podcasting. And Tom, we were talking before about, sort of the getting started and that type of thing. One thing that I really like about podcasting is we run a marketing firm, and, the old idea of a case study, just like, hey, we'd like to do a case study on your company. What's amazing for me, and no one has figured this out yet, not many people, let's say it that way. We will ask a company, hey, can you get us a case study? And they'll be like, no, they'll never agree to a case study. We can't get it through legal, I'm like, well, could you get them to come on a podcast and tell a customer story? Like, yeah, they'd probably do that. They tell you the exact same thing in a far more interesting way in that customer story than they do in the case study. And we don't have to go and format it just right and make sure the quote is good and all those kind of things. So it's still a sneaky way, in my opinion, to like slip a case study past the legal department because they don't see it that way. It's such an amazing thing. So yeah.
And I would add to that is you're asking them not for homework. You're asking them for, it's almost like an invitation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you say, hey, do you want to do a case study? Oh, geez, this is another thing. I've got to get legal to sign off of it, all the rest of this. It's like writing a blog for me.
Right.
It's a homework assignment.
Yeah.
But speaking on a podcast, getting invited to a podcast, that's fun. It's easy. And then, like you said before the break there, you can repurpose that. You can get a month's worth of content from every podcast interview.
Yeah. And I try to do as many of them as evergreen as possible so we can bring them back and we can reuse them and that type of thing. So what are some of the objections? Like one of the ones I know is people are like, oh, it takes a lot of equipment. Like I've really got to have the right studio. So what are some of the things that you run into that you have to get around on that?
It's that whole idea of if you look for reasons not to do it, you'll find it. But it's easy, right? All you need is a microphone, a computer, a decent camera, and a quiet place. And people will say, well, I don't have a studio. My office isn't that quiet. Well, just get the right microphone, right? For $60, you can get the right microphone that doesn't pick up the background noise. Mm-hmm. And if you've done a Zoom call, right? If anybody's done a Zoom call in the last few years, you're ready for a podcast interview because it's really just a discussion. Yeah. Where I see people making the mistake, though, Eric, is often they'll come in and say, oh, I want to do a podcast. And they'll buy the equipment, they'll buy all of these things. And there's a lot of work and thought that goes into that. And what they don't realize is that 80% of the podcasts that die within the first 10 episodes. Mm. So before you make this big commitment and tell the world about your new podcast, a great way to sort of try before you are all in is to guest. So go on other people's podcasts, see how they do it. Make sure you're comfortable with it. Get your licks in, get your practice as a guest. Then you're much, much more confident once you go in and host your podcast.
Yeah, and that's just such smart advice. When the pandemic started, I have a good friend of mine who does executive coaching, and so she called me and she's like, well, so I don't have anything to do the next 6 to 9 months. And she's like, what should I do? And I'm like, go be a guest on every podcast that'll take you. Like, just go do that, because you're going to start to rebuild people. And what I love about doing it is then people think they know you. It's a way to start, that's that slow clap drum for the funnel on that backside. And by being a guest, it's far easier. You don't have to come up with the questions. You're just responding. Somebody's getting to know you. So yeah, so that's really smart. So talk to me specifically. I mean, I know, but tell people how does your Interview Valet service work? Like, what does Interview Valet do?
So early on, a client said, I want to be the guest. You take care of all the rest, right? And I'm like, oh, that's good copy. We're taking that. And really, it's the idea of people come to us that they've got a message to get out there. They want to find the right audience. They want to know the right ways how to move people from being a passive listener to an active visitor to an engaged lead. They want the strategy behind it because it's not just about a podcast appearance, right? It's about getting results from each one. So we've got a team and we onboard them. We get them all the equipment. We teach them how to use it. We come together with that one sheet, right? Don't ever give a podcaster a 10-page media kit, right? Most of them are not trained journalists and they're looking at it on their phone.
Right.
It's 9 pages of stuff to say no to. So we boil it down into one sheet. We prepare them for every interview to say, here's the podcast you're going to be on. Here's background on the host, the audience, all their social media, things to stay away from. So we set them all up for that. And then we always do the feedback afterwards, both from the host and the guest. And because we always want to get better and we want you to get better because at the end of the day, we're optimizing for results, not just another podcast appearance.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and thinking about how to improve it over time. I'd love to go back, and I'd also probably dread to go back and listen to or watch the first ones, as you start to get down the path. I had a guy on the radio one time and it was an hour show, right? So this guy shows up, he's in the studio, and no matter what I asked him, I could have asked him the most open-ended question in the world. He would answer yes or no. And we got to the first commercial break and I was like, dude, you're killing me. You got to say something, right? I think he was nervous, right? But that's probably the worst I've ever had. Most of the time, you're just getting to know somebody and learning their story and being curious. It's just kind of getting to know somebody over a cup of coffee or a glass of whiskey, depending upon the time of day, right?
Eric, we do a walkthrough interview. I say I do a walkthrough interview with every one of our clients.
Yeah.
Because if they're going to learn something, let's learn it on my interview, not when it goes live.
Right.
And your story reminded me of a gentleman we worked with. He's on one of the national news, right? He's a cybersecurity analyst. He's probably on there 3 nights a week, and he wanted to get out into podcasts. And I had to walk him through that. This guy was so media trained. His answers were so tight. I was just like, Morgan, you're going to kill him, right? This is a 40-minute podcast interview, and you just gave them the perfect 40-second answer, right? Got to stretch this out, tell some stories. So I think when people have never been on TV or radio, it can be tough because it's tough to get it really tight. Yeah. But podcasts are so much easier. You can talk, you can have the discussion. So to me, it's much, much more approachable.
You talked a second ago, the stat about most podcasts don't make it past the 10th podcast. Do you know the reason? Did they share that?
I've never seen the reason, but I've heard a lot of people talk about it, right? It's like so many things. There's the excitement, right? This is going to be fun. And then life gets in the way, right? Something comes up and you miss a week, you miss a couple of weeks. It's like going to the gym, right? And then all of a sudden you don't go there.
Yeah.
The other thing too is that some people don't see the results right away.
And that drives me crazy. Content is a slow burn, right? Because we'll share blogs and content out, and we do monthly reporting for our clients. And we don't want to report to them in the first month how that content did because it doesn't matter. What it matters is how it performs over 6 to 9 months. And at some point, if it's clutter, we get rid of it. But you don't know. You really don't know. My most viral blog, I used to write for Inc., and I wrote an article I hated one weekend. I hated it so much I almost didn't even let it run. I was up against a deadline. I didn't know what else to write about. So I wrote the article. I didn't like it. I took it down, and I was like, well, what else am I going to run this week? And then I ran it, and it was my most viral article, and I had no idea, I couldn't have guessed it, right? And then there are other meteor pieces, and they weren't viral. They didn't hit the day that it happened, but they've been my longer term pieces. They've done much better over time. So really measuring content, it's this always on instant society that we live in. They expect immediate results, and that's just not how this works.
Immediate results and perfect numbers, right?
Yeah.
I love the way Rand Fishkin tells his story. He wrote a book called Lost and Founder, great book. And he's like, if I'm speaking at an event or I'm speaking on a podcast, right? and somebody's like, oh, this is great. I got to go back to his website. And they don't spell the name quite correct, right? But there's a Google ad that pops up, right? And they click that. Well, Google's going to say, we brought you this lead, right? And now, and they didn't. Now you get confused. You leave the site, and because of Facebook retargeting, it pops back up, and you click on it, and they're going to say, oh, Facebook brought this.
Yeah.
Well, no, right? It's a little bit of everything. And he said, if you think you have to have perfect attribution, right? You should never do public speaking again. You shouldn't do networking. You shouldn't do podcast interviews. You know they work, but this idea that you're going to get a printout, and you could say some of those printouts are the person that's giving you the data is also the one that's selling you it. So I don't want to say they lie, but they're going to take credit for every good thing that happens.
Yeah, and that's very key to our world, because we don't sell paper, we don't sell T-shirts or water or anything. We're all educational, so it's all B2B educational work, and so it's 6 to 9 months to see a payoff. And I do a presentation called "Making Sense of the Modern Day Marketing Maze," and it's typically 21 touch points, 21. Before someone decides they're going to pick up the phone, call your salesperson, hit that call to action, download something, and then 5 to 7 more for sales to convert the person. So all these things you're putting together are, building that reputation. And one of the things I like, because we're also in that space, your clients take a long time to decide to work with us, that type of thing, is when I meet someone and they think they know me. And the reason they think they know me is they've seen all my videos, they've heard the podcast, and I've never met them, right? And which kind of puts you on your heel, because you meet them and they're like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, I don't know anything about you, and I feel bad, right? Because I should. But getting people to stop thinking about it, because we've been trained marketing as a transactional thing, right? I show you something, you decide to buy it. And most of the important sales are not made that way.
Well, and I think that's a major difference, right? There's some marketing that is low value, high volume.
Right.
It's very transactional, right? You're one funnel away, right? And that makes sense and it works. But then you get to higher level sales, relationship sales, and you can't just take those things and scale them up.
Yeah.
Right. It's a totally different thing. As you were talking about that, it reminded me of a book. Stephen Covey's son wrote it. It's called The Speed of Trust.
Yeah.
And, when people know you, when they know your voice, when they know your heart, right, they've got that trust and everything speeds up. And without that trust, everything is just going to slow down. And, it's the way the world is today, right?
Yeah.
We're all have gotten burned by so many people that overpromised and underdelivered. So our guard is up. And it's not until people get to know you and trust you that you can move the sale along.
Yeah, and everybody knows the trick now. So they know when to say hit one of your digital properties, you're going to start retargeting them. So they'll avoid them as much as possible, look everywhere else. And I've got a guy who's primarily a sales coach, and he talks about how people hate to be sold, but they love to buy. So if you make them feel like they're buying, then they're in all day long. But if you're trying to sell them on it, then they don't want to be sold. They want to feel like they made their informed decision. So in our last few minutes, so if I'm thinking about podcasting, if it's a thing that how do I get started? Like, what's a good way for me to kind of even just dip my toe? I know you say being a guest, but how do I even think about being a guest? Like, do I just reach out to someone who has a podcast? Does that work?
Well, you think about what your goal is. Start with why.
Okay.
What are you trying to do?
Yeah.
Right? It's not just get on a podcast. And then who are you trying to talk to? Right? Who's your ideal customer?
Yeah.
Right? And one of the things you'll find is often the audience is like the host or aspires to be like the host.
Yeah.
Right? So just don't go, well, I want to be on Joe Rogan's podcast. Right? Well, are your customers listening to Joe Rogan's podcast? Right? And it's going on with a comedian can be dangerous on that. So,
Yes.
More is not better, better is better. So really focusing in on that. And then I think going with the right heart, right? I'm thinking, what can I do in order to add value there, right? Gary Vaynerchuk always calls about jab, 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 right hook. All right, I look at it as serve, 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 ask, right? So if you reach out to them and here's how you could serve your audience, you listen to the podcast, leave them a rating and review. All of a sudden, they start asking you to be on there.
Yeah.
And the other thing, too, is if you do a good job, it can be viral, right? So at the end of the podcast, podcasters know podcasters. They invite you or introduce you to someone else. You can just tap into that.
Yeah.
Now, some people want to do all the work themselves. Other people say, just let me be the guest. You do the rest. And so there's a lot of ways to do it out there. I would just remind anybody that if you're not doing it yourself, whoever's doing it for you represents you. So, if they're sending spammy emails, it makes you look spammy.
Yeah, and I've got one other piece of advice. Having had the column with ink for so long, I would get pitched all the time, and people would think that the pitch was bad. But what I would do is I would go look at their social media presence, and if they were not sharing content and they didn't have followers and they were a ghost online, I would not write about them, because the way I got paid was by eyeballs. Like, the more people who read my article, the better. And so they would think they'd send me a bad pitch, but what they had was a bad subject that I knew wasn't going to help promote my content. So make sure if you're going to get into this and you want to be a guest, you need to feed into go at least have a picture on LinkedIn. At least go get a headshot. So, well, good. So how do people reach out to you? How do they get information on you and your company?
So our testing has shown the best way on a podcast interview is to give people one place to go, right? They're multitasking, right? So don't confuse them. So the best practice is always one place. Go to interview, Valet with a V.com/claw, right? On there's a few things, right? There's an assessment. Will podcast interview marketing work for me? 10 questions, right? I wrote a book called Podcast Guest Profits, How to Grow Your Business with the Targeted Interview Strategy. You can buy it on Amazon, or if you go there, I'm happy to give you a copy. And then finally, I'll put all my social media, my calendar, scheduling link. If you'd like to talk with me about how you could use this in your business to build your business and build your brand, just go back to interviewvalet.com/claw.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. It was great having you as a guest on my podcast today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate all you do.
And so you've been listening to The Claw. I'm Eric Holtzclaw, Chief Strategist at Liger. The Claw is the marketing podcast for C-suite executives. We talked today on a podcast about podcasting and how that can be a powerful tool in your B2B marketing toolkit. Until next time.